I forgot to say when I introduced myself, I told you my ancestor, but I didn't tell you I'm the father of Lucas and Celeste. They're not here today, but they are with me. And as well as I'm very much aware that I have ancestors, I'm also aware that I will be an ancestor. And I hope that 7 generations in the future, people can tell my great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren will look back today and say there was a shift in time. People became conscious in our society on whether they are and whether they were good ancestors. And in fact, they were good ancestors. And it's already starting on Twitter and in press releases and things online where people say, don't they want to be good ancestors? Willen ze geen goede voorouders zijn in Dutch? So the hashtag good ancestor is a good one. And I'm very happy to have the guy in the room that actually introduced us to that. Yeah, you can already come forward. Roman Krznaric, give him a good applause and a beautiful applause. He's here in the Netherlands for several more talks, not just with us today, so I'm very happy. And I could say he's an ethical influencer. Because what law is often solidified ethics, right? We put on paper what we already feel as a society. And I think what Roman is teaching us is actually to be good ancestors, to be aware of that we are good ancestors. So we're amazingly happy to have you here, Roman. And the floor is yours. How to be a good ancestor. Roman Krznaric.
So, hello. It's a huge pleasure to be here, and I want to start with a confession, really, which is that I used to be a political scientist many years ago. I'm not anymore. I'm not involved in any academic institutions, but in the 1990s, I was apparently an expert on democratic governance and human rights. I used to teach courses on that at universities, but during that time, it never once occurred to me that our political institutions fail to represent the interests or rights of future generations. The thought never even entered my head, despite all the different lectures I used to give about these things. But over the years, luckily over the last 10 years, this has started to change. And I ended up writing a book to try and explore those ideas called The Good Ancestor. And I want to talk today about some of the ideas from that book which I hope are relevant to this discussion over these 2 days. Particularly 2 questions really, which is, the first one which is, why should we care about future generations? One that once of course was mentioned. And then the second one was, how do we embed that care in our political and legal institutions? 2 seemingly quite simple questions, but they're really, I found them really difficult to think about and talk about. Certainly when I start thinking about them myself, one of my starting points is with my own family, like Jan's talking about his children. Well, here are my children, Cass and Siri. This is a photograph from late 2019. It was the time of the UK general election. And at that time, my partner and I decided to give our children our votes. They were then 11 years old. So we sat around the kitchen table, as you can see, and we discussed the different party manifestos and how the electoral system worked. And they then told us where to put the X on the ballot sheet. One of them luckily followed our opinions. The other one went off in a different direction. But that's what it's all about. Now, why did we do this? Of course, because it's a recognition that our political systems and our societies fail to recognize the interests of the generation upon generation of children who will inhabit the future. And it's clear that this matters because we live in an age of chronic short-term thinking, that our politicians can't see beyond the next election or even the latest tweet, that our businesses can't see beyond the quarterly report, that nations sit around international conference tables arguing with each other while the planet burns and species disappear, which is what we've just seen at COP26 in Glasgow. And of course, as individuals, we're looking at our phones and clicking the buy now button. I believe this is the age, the tyranny of the now, and we need long-term thinking. We need to be thinking about issues like the rights of future generations because of multiple long-term threats on the horizon. We need to be planning long-term for the next pandemic that might be coming our way. We need to be thinking about the impacts of new technologies, artificial intelligence, right? Lethal autonomous weapons, synthetic biology. We need to be thinking about racial injustice and wealth inequality that get passed on from generation to generation, embedded in criminal justice systems and public culture more generally. And of course, we need more long-term thinking to deal with the global ecological crisis in all its different manifestations. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. talked about the fierce urgency of the now. And of course, around the ecological crisis, particularly, these issues are here right now. The wildfires in California right now, the droughts in Kenya right now. But you pick up an IPCC report and you know it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. So we need to be thinking long term. And I guess metaphorically, the way I think about this is I believe we have colonized the future, that we treat the future like a distant colonial outpost where we can freely dump ecological degradation and technological risk as if there was nobody there. And, you know, I'm from Australia and very much aware that the idea that when Britain colonized Australia in the 18th and 19th century, they drew on a legal doctrine now known as terra nullius, nobody's land, the idea that there was nobody there, it's ours for the taking. Of course, there was somebody there. There was the indigenous population. And I think now, alongside terra nullius, because these struggles for land rights, indigenous land rights, of course, are still going on in Australia, alongside terra nullius, we now have something else, which I think of as tempus nullius, that we treat the future as sort of empty time, a place that's empty of people. And yet, of course, we know it isn't. And the tragedy, of course, is that future generations aren't here to do anything about this pillaging of their inheritance. They cannot throw themselves in front of the king's horse like a suffragette. They can't, block an Alabama bridge like a civil rights protester. They can't go on a salt march to defy their colonial oppressors like Mahatma Gandhi. They don't have these rights embedded in the political system. They don't have any influence in the marketplace. And I think this is kind of quite well summarized by this cartoon, that's the crap we inherited, that's our crap, we'll let the grandkids sort it out. We're dumping all these things on these future generations, colonial racism, toxic waste, debt, climate impacts, and those kinds of things. But it's quite hard, I think, to grasp, just the scale of this injustice and to, in a way, to even find the right language for it. And I think that language is emerging already from what we've been talking about. I mean, the great immunologist Jonas Salk, who developed the first polio vaccine in the 50s, said that the big question of our time, in the 1970s, he said this, is this question: are we being good ancestors? So I'm certainly not the first person to say this, and neither was he, I don't think. I imagine he took it from indigenous cultures. I asked his son where he got it from, and he didn't actually know, but let's say Jonas Salk, I first saw him ask this question, or saw it written in 1977. So I think it's a good question. It's an inclusive question. And I want to say a bit about, how do we take that question and turn it into something practical around the rights of future generations and the rights of the living world? And my starting point is really to think about the idea of intergenerational justice. So in this book I've written, The Good Ancestor, I talk about 6 different ways to think long-term. Deep time, humility, a legacy mindset, a transcendent goal, all sorts of different ways. But one of those 6 is this one, the idea of intergenerational justice, which I think is the most sort of closest link to these sort of political, legal issues that we're talking about today. It's really about, what obligations do we have to those generations to come? And what rights do they have? And it's not an obvious question, I don't think. I mean, the great comedian Groucho Marx said, why should I care about future generations? What have they ever done for me? And I think that's often how people feel. Look, I've got enough stuff going on in my life now. Why should I be worrying 7 generations ahead or even 3 generations ahead? But I think there's actually, probably over the last 50 years, at least in Western culture, I'll say something about non-Western culture in a moment. In Western culture, I think there have been sort of 4, in Western, say, philosophical culture, there have been sort of 4 broad arguments given about why we should care about future generations. That basic question of why should we, how would we answer Groucho Marx? And I just want to say something about these 4 different motives for intergenerational justice, as I think of them. I call them the arrow, the blindfold, the baton, and the scales. Now, let me just start with the scales. That, as you can see on the slide there, is about weighing up the well-being of those alive today against all those yet to be born. And let me just explain that a bit more. Have a look at this image here. It shows, I call it the scale of unborn generations, that there are 7.7 billion of us alive today. Now, over the past 50,000 years, let's get really long-term here, more than 7 generations. Over the past 50,000 years, an estimated nearly 100 billion people have been born and died. But going forward over the next 50,000 years, assuming current birth rates level off and stabilize this century, nearly 7 trillion people will be born. There in that big orange circle. I mean, in the next 2 centuries alone, tens of billions of people will be born, amongst them all your grandchildren and their grandchildren and the friends and communities on whom they'll depend. And there's that question that we've heard already, how are those future generations going to judge us for what we did or didn't do when we had the chance? And philosophically, this is really something that comes out of utilitarian philosophy, an idea of sort of balancing up pains and pleasures and thinking about it through time, that surely, given all these billions to come, don't we have some kind of obligation, especially because never before in human history have our actions had such potentially destructive impacts on future generations. Probably since July 16th, 1945, when the Trinity test happened, the first nuclear test. That was the moment when we were able to destroy humanity, probably the first moment, but of course we've just found more and more ways to do that, particularly through the fossil fuel industry and other things that we all know about now. So that's a kind of a utilitarian way of thinking about it. Another way is what I call the arrow, to treat people of equal worth independent of when they happen to be born. And you can find this kind of argument, it's been around in philosophers like Derek Parfit and others for a long time. So Derek Parfit gives this example of, imagine shooting an arrow into a distant woodland, and you know somebody is there, but you can't see them. But just because you can't see them, and just because they're far away, it doesn't mean you don't have any responsibility, as the person who shot an arrow. And there's the idea there is, of course, just as we should have a responsibility, across space, a distant woodland, we should have responsibility through time. Just because future generations, we can't see them and they're far away, doesn't mean we don't have any obligations to them. Of course we do. I mean, it's just like, if you plant a bomb in a train to blow up a child, right? We would all think there's something we shouldn't do, that there's something wrong about that. But it's equally bad if we set the bomb to go off in 10 minutes or 10 hours or 10 years. The time shouldn't be a factor there. That's the idea of the arrow, right? The time and space are the same, in a sense. A third argument I call the blindfold, which is to imagine the world you'd want if you didn't know into which generation you were born. Now, that's an idea that comes from the philosopher, John Rawls in his book, A Theory of Justice, first published in the early 70s. And as you probably know, Rawls's, the basic idea was imagining, if you're trying to create a theory of justice, imagine that you're behind a veil of ignorance. You don't know into what part of society you might be born, whether you're going to be rich or poor, or black or white, or man or woman, whatever. And he asked that question of, okay, how would you distribute the resources in a society? And as any undergraduate philosophy student learns, broadly he'd say, well, you certainly wouldn't want to live in an incredibly unequal world, just in case you were born living on the streets of Calcutta. But Rawls also talks a little bit about, I don't think in a very sophisticated way, but about imagining, let's take it further, not just not knowing into what part of society you'd be born in today, but imagine this through time. If you didn't know what generation you'd be born into, if you didn't know if you're going to be born in 10 years' time or 100 years' time when the world is on fire or the country is flooded. So I think that's quite an interesting way and another way to think about these issues. To think, if we didn't know what generation we'd be born into, well, how would we try and organize our society today and its potential impacts on those generations to come? And the fourth and final sort of philosophical approach I call the baton, like in a relay race where you pass on a baton. To treat future generations how you would want past generations to have treated you. And I think it's really important when we're thinking about all these issues, it's already been mentioned, to think about the past, to think about what we have inherited. Clearly we have inherited positive legacies from the past in some ways, medical discoveries a lot of people benefit from, like the polio vaccine discovered by Salk, but we are also the inheritors of negative and destructive legacies of slavery and colonialism and racism, creating deep inequities that must now be repaired, and legacies of economies that are structurally addicted to fossil fuels and endless growth that we must now transform. So there's a real question there about, okay, given what we've inherited, what are we going to pass on? Which bits are we going to leave behind, and which bits are we going to pass on? And for me, that connects to the great empathic principle found in most religions and sort of moral value systems, which is the idea of the golden rule. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. But normally when we come across that idea, we think about it across space, not through time. We think about, okay, I should treat that other person on the other side of the world, or the person homeless on the street in front of me, how I'd want to be treated myself. But why not create an intergenerational golden rule? Why not treat future generations how we would want to have been treated by past generations ourselves? So that's another way of thinking about this, an intergenerational golden rule. Now, when I look at these four sort of philosophical approaches to why we should care, I kind of feel there's something missing there. And I think what's missing, which I think was sort of mentioned by Rolf in a way, which is the idea of some sense of human beings' connection with nature. Something to do with ecological stewardship, some sense that we've inherited a planet that we are temporary custodians of, and then we must pass it on to the next generation, at least in as good shape as we found it, and hopefully better. And I think that idea is embodied very well, as Fons was mentioning, about the idea of the seventh generation principle, which the Canadian law professor John Burroughs has called the seventh generation principle a significant element of indigenous law. And here's a quote from Oren Lyons, a chief from the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois Confederacy. He says this: "We're looking ahead, as is one of the first mandates given us as chiefs, to make sure that every decision that we make relates to the welfare and the well-being of the seventh generation to come. And that's the basis by which we make decisions in council. Will this be to the benefit of the seventh generation?" And indigenous peoples around the world tend to have, you can find this idea. Sometimes it's 7 generations forward and 7 generations backwards. Sometimes it's our generation is the middle one and it's 3 forward and 3 backwards. In a way, it's not about the exact number of generations. It's not about a rational calculus of counting forward 7 times 30 years to 210 years or anything like that. I think it's really about a principle of respect, in a sense, and a principle of stewardship. But that just raises a question of, okay, let's take all these ideas, these various reasons why we might feel connected and should have some moral obligation to those future generations. How do we then embed that politically and legally in different ways? Now, since 1993, if you look at various UN documents of various kinds, the word future generation appears in at least 200 of them. There's been lots of talk about future generations, and lots of political scientists and legal thinkers have been trying to think about how we would embed these kinds of the interests of future generations in our systems of political and legal systems. But sort of trying to simplify it down, I think that there are 3 key ways which we might try and do this. I think of these as design principles of deep democracy. I use the term deep democracy partly in honor of the idea of deep time, that idea that humankind is just an eye blink in the cosmic story, that we should take a longer term perspective. Let's our politics do that as well. But also I use deep democracy because political scientists often talk about the idea of democracy having been hollowed out over the last 20 or 30 years in different ways. So how do we sort of give it more depth? And this is about redesigning what our institutions look like, because our political institutions, in a way, in most Western democracies, were born in the Holocene. Representative democracy, nation states emerged in the 18th and 19th century. Well, the world has changed. We are now in the Anthropocene. Obviously, those institutions might have fundamental things that they're missing. They weren't designed to deal with the fact that half of the Netherlands will be underwater by 2300, you know, or that kind of prospect. They weren't designed to do that. They were designed to solve different kinds of problems, to emerge out of empires and all sorts of stuff. So how would we redesign democracy? So I think there's these three main ways. Like Fons mentioned, you know, the idea of guardians of the future, and then there's citizens' assemblies and intergenerational rights. So let me just say a little something about each of those. So we've heard about this idea of the guardian of the future, like this is Sophie Howe, the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. And as you probably know, that under the Welsh Wellbeing for Future Generations Act of 2015, her job is to look at the impact of public policy pretty much up to 30 years ahead. So not quite 7 generations, but at least for most politicians, 30 years is a hell of a long time, right? And she's supposed to look at the impact, not just on environmental legislation, but on employment, transport, education, a whole load of things. But as she will admit herself, she said, well, the biggest problem I face, in a way, she would say, is that she doesn't have very much power. You know, she's got the power to persuade, but not much more than that. But my daughter also pointed out another problem with the Future Generations Commissioner. She was saying, why should I trust her to represent my interests and those of all my friends? We have all sorts of different things that we worry about. Maybe she doesn't know anything about us. There's a real problem, I think, of legitimacy around the idea of the guardian. Like when you pick up Plato's Republic and you see him talking about guardians, it's that same question. You know, why would I think this one person, non-elected person, should be someone I should trust to be the steward for all those billions of people? Now, Sophie Howe, she's a fantastic person, so I actually do happen to trust her, but who knows what commissioners we might get. So on this theme of thinking about what a guardian could look like, well, maybe there's different ways we could design the idea of guardianship. So I'm part of a sort of campaign in the UK which has been inspired by the Welsh Future Generations Commissioner for the whole UK to have a Future Generations Commission, slightly different from a commissioner. And this idea is to have a Wellbeing for Future Generations Act for the whole of the UK. It's a bill that's currently in Parliament now, as you might know, if you follow these things. It was introduced in Parliament through the House of Lords, through the upper house by the guy on the right there called John Bird, who's a really well-known anti-poverty campaigner. He started a magazine called The Big Issue. He got interested in it. He wasn't actually interested in climate change, but suddenly he realized that who's going to be hit hardest by climate impacts? Well, it's going to be people living on the social margins, people who are living on the streets, to recognize there are these sort of differential effects, that there isn't just one future, as we heard before, but there are many. And so there's a bill in Parliament now, and I've always been, a bit involved in drafting it. And one of the things we decided to do was, instead of the idea of, in the bill, having just a single Future Generations Commissioner, the idea is to have instead of having the idea of a commissioner, the idea is to have a commission, a group of people. So we've created a kind of a shadow commission based on what we think it should look like, which has 8 people in it. It's got one expert from each of the 4 nations of the UK, so from England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and then it has one young person who's part of the commission as well. So I'm the expert for England, but then I'm paired with a young racial justice and climate activist from Manchester. And we are this Commission for Future Generations, and we're trying to sort of create a campaign for the UK around this idea. So that's trying to give it a little bit more legitimacy. Then there's the question of power. I mean, in the bill, the Commission would be able to apply to the High Court to take government departments or hold them to account for failing to comply with the Commission's recommendations. It also has got a citizens' assembly or citizen jury aspect to it as well. Now, the problem with this, though, is the current government is going to crush it, probably. right? But we're still trying to create a political campaign around it and hope that some elements of it might be introduced as parts of other legislation. Who knows? It's actually going really well so far. There's a tweet from last week on the right-hand side there saying that it just got through another stage in the Byzantine process that goes on in British politics through the House of Lords. So this is something about the different ways you might think about being a guardian of the future. But the second design principle of deep democracy, I think, is the idea of citizens' assemblies. And clearly there's a huge amount of energy around this that's emerged in the last 10 years. The idea of trying to, in a way, revitalize the democracies which are dying around us, particularly as we see the rise of far-right populism and seen the decline of faith in democracy and in political parties across Europe in the last 30 years. And citizens' assemblies have been there or emerged to try and redress this in some ways, and we've seen them at work in Ireland, which they've had a big impact on recent abortion legislation. We've seen them in Iceland and Belgium and Spain and all sorts of different places. The idea of sortition and having randomly selected members of the public debate and discuss matters that matter. And one of the interesting things about citizens' assemblies is that there's increasing evidence from great thinkers about this, like Graham Smith in the UK has written a book called Can Democracy Safeguard the Future? Increasing evidence that citizens' assemblies aren't just good at sort of reviving or bringing a kind of ancient Greek-style participatory politics back into our democratic systems, but they're actually really good at thinking long-term. They're good at they're not caught in those same short-term cycles. And I've been part of as an expert witness at citizens' assemblies, and maybe some of you here have been too. And it's quite remarkable how they're just willing to listen and learn and think and take a longer view on issues. Of course, one of the problems is that you can have a citizens' assembly like they recently had the climate assembly in France, and then the government just decides not to listen to any of it, as Macron just failed to listen to that. But one of the examples, I like the really creative versions of citizens' assemblies. So here's one. This is from Japan. You may know about this. This is a movement called Future Design. It's kind of a citizen assembly-based way of trying to represent the interests of future generations. It's directly inspired by that Native American idea of seventh generation decision making. And what they do is they invite local people to discuss and draw up plans for the towns and cities where they live. And they typically divide them into two groups. Half are told that they're residents from the present day, and the other half are given these orange ceremonial robes to wear, and I happen to have one with me here. I'll put this on. This is from the small town of Yahaba, population 30,000, northern Japan. And the residents who are given the orange gowns are told to imagine themselves as residents from the year 2060. Okay? And it turns out the residents from 2060 systematically advocate far more transformative plans for their towns and cities, whether it's long-term investment in healthcare or education or dealing with an aging population or action on climate. And the guy who founded it, Tatsuyoshi Saijo, who's actually an economist by background, he's instigated a whole load of studies of impact showing how discount rates get reduced, how people in these towns, when they do this, they're willing to pay higher taxes. It's really, really well documented. That's one of the reasons it's interesting. It's also interesting because it's spreading. So future design is now used in big cities like Kyoto. It's being used in Japan's Ministry of Finance. It's being used in big companies like Fujitsu in their sustainability planning. I think it's a really interesting way, a non-legal way, I guess, of trying to bring the voice of future generations into the room. And I think it's part of the package that we need. And I think more citizens' assemblies could be more creative in explicitly trying to get people to imagine the future. So I'll just take off my gown again because I want to change my slide, because there's a third way of thinking about redesigning democracy, which is the idea of the rights of future generations, this intergenerational justice, the legal systems. And when I was writing my book, I didn't realize how important this was going to become. These, in a way, an explosion of legal interest and cases around future generations' rights. The image here is from the public interest law firm in the US, Our Children's Trust. as many of you probably know, they are campaigning, or they've launched a campaign on behalf of the 21 young people there who are campaigning for the legal right to a safe climate and healthy atmosphere for both current and future generations. They are suing the federal government, and there's been a lot of these, they've been having these huge arguments over the last 5 years about whether the case is admissible and so on. They may well fail. They're getting ready for the next case. But it's exciting, I think, that there are these legal cases going on. And we know that there are other cases going on all over the place. The agenda case in the Netherlands, a recent German constitutional court case, cases in Australia. The founder of Our Children's Trust, Julia Olson, recently sent me something from a court ruling from the Supreme Court of Pakistan, which I want to read out to you. It's a bit long, but I'm going to read it out. This is from a ruling where the Supreme Court of Pakistan upheld a ruling of the government of Punjab against one of Pakistan's biggest cement company, which stopped them from building these new cement works. And this is what it said in this Supreme Court ruling. It said, another important dimension of climate change is intergenerational justice and the need for climate democracy. The tragedy is that tomorrow's generations aren't here to challenge this pillaging of their inheritance. The great silent majority of future generations is rendered powerless and needs a voice. This court should be mindful that its decisions also adjudicate upon the rights of future generations of this country. It is important to question ourselves, how will the future generations look back on us and what legacy we leave for them? This court and the courts around the globe have a role to play in reducing the effects of climate change for our generation and the generations to come. Through our pen and jurisprudential fiat, we need to decolonize our future generations from the wrath of climate change by upholding climate justice at all times. Now, when I saw this, I was slightly surprised because these words are taken directly from my book and from a TED talk I gave, right? Which is quite shocking for me because my books aren't normally quoted in legal cases. And in fact, it footnoted my book and my TED talk, which is bizarre. But what it shows, I think, is something larger about that these judges were trying to find a language to talk about something that they knew was right. And I think that's what the Maastricht Principles are all about. It's trying to give a language for this, so they don't have to quote from a book like mine, but they can quote from the Maastricht Principles. But I just thought it was absolutely fascinating and really, really interesting. So I see sort of unexpected hope, I think, in the legal system. I'm not a lawyer, and I generally don't have great faith in the speed at which legal change can happen. But I look at this and think, wow, that's really interesting. Can I just speak for another few minutes? Am I okay for time? 2 minutes. Let me just say something, just finishing about something that lurks behind all of this, which is that I hear people saying this all the time. I hear my father saying this too. He says, okay, it's fine to talk about all these rights of future generations, but what we really need is not changes in democracy. What we need is a benevolent dictator to come and sort out our problems for us. This is the secret conversation going on around the world, actually. And I'm interested in this partly because I used to be a political scientist. I used to be very interested in measuring the quality of democracy, sort of quantitative political science stuff. And so I decided to ask myself, well, is it really true? People always say, oh, we must become more like China. Look at their long-term investment in green energy. We must become more like Singapore, long-term investment in healthcare and education. They're being good ancestors. I thought, well, is it actually true that authoritarian states perform better than democracies when it comes to long-term public policy? What is the actual empirical evidence? Well, to do that, you need two things. First, you need a measure of long-term public policy impact. And that's what, that's what this is here. This is an index called the Intergenerational Solidarity Index, developed by a guy called Jamie McQuilkin. It's in my book. And what it does is it measures long-term public policy for 122 countries across 10 indicators, environmental, social, ecological, like renewable energy in the system or long-term investment in healthcare, puts them together, ranks them, Iceland and Sweden at the top, but lots of non-OECD countries in there too, Nepal, Uruguay, Costa Rica do well on this index. Country, I'm from Australia, does very badly. Britain, 45, the US, 62. So this is one aspect of this. So this is sort of long-term public policy performance. But then what we did is that we then mapped this against quality of democracy. And on the x-axis here, that's the Intergenerational Solidarity Index. Going that way is more intergenerational solidarity or good long-term public policy. The y-axis is from a measure of liberal democracy called the VDEM liberal democracy measure from the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. And basically, when you plot the 122 countries, you can see the best fit line goes up from left to right, showing that more democracy means more long-term policy outcomes. Of the 25 highest scoring countries on the Intergenerational Solidarity Index, 21 of them are democratic states, and of the 25 lowest scoring countries, 21 of them are autocracies. In other words, China and Singapore are kind of outliers, so we shouldn't rely on a benign dictator as the obvious answer. The evidence just is not there, right? But it doesn't mean that democracies can rest easy and sort of think that everything's fine. Every democratic country needs to deepen its democracy, needs to embed the interests and rights of future generations, and I believe that here we are, a group of time rebels dedicated to doing that very thing. So let me stop right there.
Amazing, Roman. Yeah, we could listen to you for many, many more hours. Please stay here.
Okay.
And in fact, today, somebody, Shana, this morning said, today is the World Day of Philosophy. How great it is to have Roman here, and how great it is to have all these philosophers in the room, and to philosophize about our future and about a sustainable future. There are obviously questions for Roman from the room and otherwise from the Zoom. I already saw a few. Is there anyone that has a question? Wait until the person with the mic is with you.
And do ask anything you like at all.
Yeah, it can also be about his kids or the tree that he loves to hug, anything, yeah.
Yeah, anything.
Please.
Yeah, well, it's an absolute honor to have you with us. That's for a start. Secondly, were you given the opportunity to talk to our political leaders in their coalition discussions? And if not, perhaps Jan van der Vis can sort it out, since the message you're sending out is very badly needed as the coalition parties here in the Netherlands try to to agree on a plan for the hopefully long future.
Yeah, go on.
So the question is, were you given that opportunity? And if not,
right.
Would there be an opportunity to do that?
I have not been invited by these parties which haven't been able to form a government yet to talk to them. But what's been really interesting, actually, since this book came out is I didn't expect I'd be invited by so many politicians in different countries to come and talk to them. So I've given briefings to British Parliament and in other countries. I've had conversations with the United Arab Emirates, has a minister for the future. And she actually has a background in engineering. I mean, now that's an interesting case. It's an autocratic country. She's head of the National Development Plan that goes to the year 2071, looking forward 50 years. And, you know, the Netherlands, well, maybe it would be a great idea if there was an ombudsman for future generations or a minister for the future. I can see one standing right there. And I think politically, you know, like, just thinking what just came to my head then was, some of the invitations I've had, say, from the British government to talk about long-term public policy. I've been invited to talk about lots of different things, sometimes about climate policy or to talk to civil servants about what kind of regulations they should have around genetic engineering and synthetic biology, to discussions about changing discount rates in the Treasury. And I guess the most striking thing is how little thinking there is in government that's really genuinely long-term. I mean, I think some civil servants are often doing that. So like in the Netherlands, I gave a talk to about the government's long-term environmental plan. I think it's called Novi or something like that, N-O-V-I. And it was talking, but a lot of them were sort of technocrats, urban planners. They had a really long-term vision about the country. But yes, I would love to speak to if anyone can arrange for me to talk to the politicians here, I'd be very happy to do so. Can I say one other little thing? The way I start talking to politicians when I do it, is I start talking about children and grandchildren and legacies, because whatever party they're from, they all have a connection with to the future through their own family lives.
Yeah, this is also my experience. And the more right-wing they become, the less they have with planet and environment, but the more they have with their own children and kin and the future of their
Right,
own
and that's
kin.
a really important point.
Yeah.
We need to
Yeah.
create a bridge
Yeah.
from that personal care for their own families to a more caring about the universal strangers of the future. You know, the British welfare state was based on this idea of the universal stranger, you know, but those universal strangers are also to come.
There's a nice question from the Zoom, Roman, and that is from a rights-based approach or a philosophical approach, should we all have a right to a fair share as well right now today? Because there's also a big difference between the North and South, with which Fons also addressed. So if there would be a right to a fair share, which would be for us and for future generations, then would we not, change the way we deal with our democracies and societies?
Yeah, I like the word fairness and the idea of fair share when thinking about this. I used to do this, one of my previous books was about empathy and the art of stepping into the shoes of others, and for some years I did training for British judges. I gave them, the judges had to do compulsory empathy training, right? And so I used to go and run these workshops, and a lot of the judges hated it, because they said, we're rational and legal, and empathy is all soft, touchy-feely, about emotions. I say, no. Empathy is actually about fairness. It's about hearing the perspective of the various people who are in front of you in a court, and taking all of their interests into account. And I think it's like that when it comes to future generations. There's a voice that we haven't heard, which is the voice of future generations. The question is, how do we bring them into the room? And also to bring in past generations into the room, so we can have the conversations about reparations around race, for example. And once all those voices are in the room, then you can have your discussion. And then you can start talking about fair shares. Now, that's always going to be difficult, talking about the tensions between current and future generations. Do they fight over resources or not? But one of the things I found, actually, when I first wrote this, while I was writing the book, I sent a copy of it to a friend of mine who is the CEO of a big children's charity that works in low-income countries, Save the Children. And he then said to me, I hate this book. He said, there are 150 million children dying of malnutrition right now. Why should we be caring down the line so much? But then gradually, over our conversations, what he realized, and we both realized in a way, was, well, if you really care about those children dying of malnutrition, then you need to do long-term investment in education, healthcare, a whole load of different things. In fact, there's an overlap between the current and future generations. These are not separate things. That's what Sophie Howe does as well in Wales. Like, you do something now to help current generations, like you have renewable transport. Well, that helps everybody, all the generations down the line, because there's a commonality we're working with here. Despite all the uncertainties of the future, we all need air to breathe and food to drink and water to drink, food to eat and water to drink. My daughter may be alive in 2100. Well, I know what she needs despite the uncertainties of the future. It's the gift of the living world. And that's why we must restore and repair and care for it.
Thank you very much. I think we have room for one more question from the room and one from the Zoom. I see 2 hands, 3 hands. Lady in the back.
Yeah, hi, thank you. You suggest the word fairness as a good word, but maybe that's also a bit left-wing. I'm looking for more general, universal words to state the urgency of your topic. Could you also say that if we're not doing this, taking into account the future generations, that we're not democratic? That could be forceful to say, that we're not democratic if we don't.
That's interesting. I've never really thought about it like that. I mean, when I think of the word fairness, if you look at these sort of philosophical studies of common values across cultures and generations and things, fairness is normally one that comes up again and again and again, that is not hotly disputed. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that one wants to find another concept. Well, when I think about this, one of the reasons I called my book The Good Ancestor is because I thought that nobody's going to disagree with that. The idea of being a good ancestor, wherever they are politically, whatever generation that they are. Most people will say, yeah, of course I want to be a good ancestor. They might have very different ideas of how they want to get there. So that, I think, is a kind of quite universal term. In a way, going back to what you were saying, Fons, about the value of human rights is the universality of it. So we need to be finding the language which is universal. So I guess around democracy, to say that it's undemocratic not to embody the rights of future generations in our political systems. Now, to me, I like that idea, that it does seem genuinely undemocratic, but I think for most people, it sounds like quite a weird idea still to give rights to future generations. It doesn't seem like our democracy is failing if we fail to give those rights. But of course, that's what cultural change is. We're trying, I think, or at least I am, on part of a journey to make it seem that it is highly undemocratic to not take their views into account. But I think it'll be quite a journey before that becomes widely accepted culturally. Yeah.
I think you almost answered the last question as well, and that will be, what do you think of increasing the influence of children in our political and legal system? For instance, by giving them a vote, you've already addressed that, and by including them in citizens' assemblies or giving them standing to litigate.
Yeah, so I definitely think children and young people should have more voice in our political systems. I was imagining at COP26, you know, why weren't there young people properly in part of the negotiations, you know? And why don't most citizens' assemblies include more young people in them? One of the criticisms, I think, of the future design, that Japanese movement, is that at least when they started, it was mostly adults. But increasingly, they're involving young people. And I think that's a good thing. The question is, you know, how young should they be? There's a political theorist in England called David Runciman who said, you know, 6-year-olds should be given the vote. I don't necessarily agree with that. In fact, the voting thing, I think, is a red herring. You know, I may have given my kids the vote, but actually, it was kind of symbolic, because even if you lower the voting age, you know, as it is, say, 16 in many countries, maybe other people have evidence of this, but I've never seen systematic evidence that lowering the voting age fundamentally changes the kind of political outcomes you get. Because so much of the system is still locked in short-termism. You've still got the same representatives, the same corporate funding, and so on. So I'm not against the idea of lowering the voting age, but as the questioner says, introducing the voice in citizens' assemblies, and then bringing those legal cases, well, the German constitutional court case that was brought by Fridays for Future Germany, and, you know, so we need young people to be bringing those cases. In Australia, exactly the same. So Portugal, lots of different cases. So yeah, we need, in a way, every climate activist needs to become a kind of an expert in law to be able to understand what it might mean to bring these cases.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Roman Krznaric. Roman also, yeah, first the applause, yeah. In your book, you also give a tip like putting a 0 before the year 2021. So it's 0 2021. So we create this long-termism. It also is in things we use and we take. And this I took from COP26. These cups were washed every day. Everybody drank from them, the youth, the delegates, the leaders, the ones who came out with the crap decision, but also the ones with hope. And I decided to nick one, to keep it, and every time again, when I drink from this cup, think about the long-term future. I don't have enough for everyone, but drink your tea now, and think about drinking from a cup that includes the future generation.
Well, let's also like get 2 cups and connect them with a string and try and hear the voices of future generations through them as well.
We'll do that tomorrow, yeah? Coffee break, yeah.